Um, Thanks for inviting me to be part of this. It's a really great group to be presenting to, so I'm honored to be invited to this. My name is Alex Van Zant. I'm at Rutgers University, and I'm going to talk about some work I published recently at Journal Personality and Social Psychology with my wonderful co-authors, Jessica Kennedy at Vanderbilt University and Laura Cray at UC Berkeley. I gotta, keep it pretty condensed. So there's a lot of detail I can't get into. So if you want to read the full paper, I have the full citation on this slide. So the literature on dishonesty suggests that there's one of two ways that we might react after getting away with a lie. On the one hand, getting away with a lie can elicit a sense of accomplishment known as duping delight, and even excitement for successfully striking a lucrative deal. But on the other hand, liars might feel guilty and even dissatisfied for resorting to dishonesty. In this research, we test the validity of these two perspectives. Now, we know a fair amount about deception and negotiation. One thing we know is that there are several situational and dispositional antecedents of choosing to deceive. Another thing we know is that there are clear social and reputational costs to detected deception. So when lies are detected, they tend to be quite costly for deceivers. But one thing we don't really know much about is the consequences of undetected deception from a psychological perspective. This research tests whether successful lies can carry psychological costs or perhaps might come with benefits for deceivers. We focus here on how undetected lies influence deceivers' subjective value, or the psychological outcomes they derive from negotiating. Subjective value captures negotiators' satisfaction with their economic outcome, the negotiation process, their perception of their relationship with counterparts, and even how the act of negotiating impacts their own self-efficacy. And importantly, it tends to have more enduring psychological consequences than even the economic terms of deal. Studies have shown it predicts things like job satisfaction and even turnover intentions, more so than things like your salary a year later on. And work has also shown that subjective value predicts negotiators' desire to bargain again with counterparts. So understanding how undetected lies impact subjective value is also likely to reveal some important insights into how it might impact relationships, even when lies go unnoticed. Now, the existing literature suggests that dishonesty should impact negotiators' subjective value in one of two ways. The first is that getting away with a lie feels exciting and elicits what's often referred to as duping delight, or positive affect that enhances negotiators' subjective value. Supporting this idea, studies have shown that cheating on individual tasks done in private can often induce positive affect. So if dishonesty elicits positive affect, one would think that it should increase negotiators' subjective value. Positive affect tends to increase with negotiators' self-efficacy, their willingness to cooperate with counterparts, and even enhances how satisfied they are with their performance. But another perspective suggests that instead, getting away with a lie might reduce negotiators' subjective value because it elicits guilt. Guilt is presumed to arise from committing ethical transgressions that harm others, such as lying, but there's surprisingly little direct evidence about whether the act of lying itself actually induces guilt. So, for example, studies of guilt in negotiation often focus on anticipated guilt, but not the actual experience of guilt. Negotiators often avoid lying in the first place because they believe it will make them feel guilty, but less is known about how they actually feel immediately after engaging in the lie. So it's unclear how well anticipatory guilt translates to experienced guilt. People are really good at rationalizing their dishonesty, and this could potentially minimize any guilt they otherwise would feel from the act of lying. And this might be one reason why studies finding evidence of cheating inducing positive affect have also failed to find evidence of it inducing negative affect in those same contexts. But none of these studies directly measure guilt. And because guilt is so strongly linked to interpersonal ethical infractions, there might be reason to expect that it elicits guilt in a negotiation context, even if it doesn't necessarily elicit other negative emotions. So if dishonesty elicits guilt, one would think that it should decrease negotiators' subjective value. Guilt tends to arise from thoughts about how one could have behaved more ethically, and this type of counterfactual thinking tends to reduce negotiators' satisfaction with their outcomes. Now, to be clear, we don't necessarily view these perspectives as mutually exclusive. There could be reason to think that dishonesty simultaneously elicits duping, delight, or positive affect and guilt at the same time. So our assumption is really that whichever emotion is most strongly elicited by dishonesty should ultimately dictate how it impacts one's subjective value. So one possibility is that dishonesty elicits more positive affect than guilt, and in turn increases negotiators' subjective value. And we refer to this in our paper as the deceiver's delight account. Another possibility, though, is that dishonesty elicits more guilt than positive affect and decreases negotiators' subjective value. In our paper, we refer to this as the deceiver's guilt account. So I'm going to talk about two studies that test these accounts. And both studies test the impact of dishonesty on affects and subjective value. But the second study also expands on it by testing the relational consequences of dishonesty. We also collected a lot of additional data, and I'm going to briefly just talk about some data we collected exploring and addressing potential boundary conditions of our findings. But what I want to highlight is that in all the studies I'm going to talk about, dishonesty enhanced negotiators' economic outcomes, so it's economically beneficial, and they largely went undetected by counterparts. So in our first study, we had focal participants play the role of a computer store owner selling a used desktop computer that had a defective graphics card. Their counterparts tried out the computer in their store and then sent a message to them to negotiate a price for the computer. We randomly assigned participants to dishonesty opportunity or control conditions. So the counterparts of control condition participants knew that the computer crashed when they tried it out, and they indicated this in a message. And they knew it was because the graphics card was defective. But in the dishonesty opportunity condition, participants knew they could potentially get away with a lie. Their counterparts sent them a message indicating that the computer worked great and that the graphics card seemed to perform well. So after completing the negotiation, we assessed participants' subjective value and affect. To measure subjective value, we used an established 13-item scale. To measure positive and negative affect, we used an abbreviated PANAS scale, which importantly does not include a measure of guilt. So we also measured guilt with two separate items. Now, when we analyzed the data, we really focused on comparing participants who chose to lie when presented the opportunity to those in the control condition who did not have the opportunity to get away with a lie in the first place. And we did this by having 3 coders code the extent to which participants were deceptive within the dishonesty opportunity condition. And supporting the deceiver's guilt account, we ultimately found that dishonest participants' subjective value was lower than that of control condition participants. And as shown on the right side of your screen, you can see that dishonesty also elicited more guilt than generalized negative affect, indicating that this was specific to guilt as opposed to necessarily being about generalized negative emotions. And we also did not find evidence of dishonesty inducing positive affect or duping delight. And if you look at the lower left-hand part of your screen, you can see that guilt mediated affected dishonesty on subjective value. So I also want to highlight real quick that these findings held when controlling for things like whether negotiators reached agreement, which tends to impact how satisfied they are, and also like their perception that the counterpart may have been suspicious that they lied. So we found these findings hold even when considering like how concerned people might be about their lies being detected. Now, we conducted another study, and it expanded on this study by adapting it to a multi-round negotiation. So as in the first study, we had focal participants were randomly assigned to control or dishonesty opportunity conditions, and they negotiated over the sale of the same defective desktop computer. But this time, after completing the first negotiation, we gave participants a message from their counterpart asking about a laptop they also had in the store. This laptop was actually in good condition, so participants had no reason to lie in this negotiation. They then proceeded to negotiate over the laptop, and at the end of the negotiation, indicated their subjective value from that second negotiation, as well as how guilty they felt. And this allowed us to see like how enduring was this effect carrying over into a second interaction. And also, did guilt maintain or did it subside over the course of that second interaction? Also, at the end of the study, we had participants, we told participants that they'd engage in a third negotiation exercise, and we gave them a choice of whether they'd like to negotiate with the same counterpart or a different randomly selected counterpart. So replicating the first study, dishonesty induced guilt and undermined participants' subjective value. But what I really want to focus on is that despite going undetected, dishonesty undermined participants' relationship with their counterparts. So as you can see on the left side of your screen, participants who were dishonest experienced lower subjective value in that second negotiation where they did not have the opportunity to deceive than control condition participants. Interestingly, though, it wasn't because guilt lingered. We found that liars, people who lied in the first negotiation, showed similar levels of guilt as control condition participants after the second negotiation. So guilt dissipated, but what we tended to find is that even though guilt influenced subjective value in the first negotiation, that reduced satisfaction that liars had with that first negotiation tended to spill over into their perception of that second interaction. And as you can see on the right side of your screen, when we gave participants the choice of who to negotiate with in a third negotiation, dishonest participants were a little bit less likely to choose to negotiate with the same counterpart in a third interaction. And at the bottom, you can see that these effects were mediated by guilt and subjective value in that first negotiation in serial order. So one could wonder how robust these findings are to certain alternative explanations or certain boundary conditions. One thing you could say that people in the cognitive dissonance literature would often suggest is that maybe large incentives could provide an external justification for dishonesty that alleviates guilt. We actually found the opposite to be true in the first study. So we found that dishonesty induced more guilt in participants who were randomly assigned to a large performance bonus than those who stood to earn a potential bonus that was less than 1/10 the size. So large incentives exacerbated rather than gave a justification that reduced guilt. Another possibility could be that lying only induces guilt among people with high moral character. But actually, in one of the studies, we measured 3 traits associated with moral character and found that dishonesty even elicited guilt in participants who exhibited relatively low levels of moral character. Another thing we found and we wanted to explore is, well, maybe if you say, hey, I'm just following somebody else's orders to lie, I didn't make the choice to lie, that would reduce guilt. But we found in 2 other studies that even when participants followed orders to lie as an agent representing somebody else, we continue to find evidence consistent with the deceiver's guilt account. So overall, we found that negotiator dishonesty elicits guilt, but not necessarily positive affect. These effects tended to be distinct from any impact of dishonesty on generalized negative affect. And we also found that despite going undetected, dishonesty still tended to have negative downstream relational consequences. Now, a couple implications I thought of more specifically for this group that we don't necessarily get into a whole lot in the paper. But one I think clearly is that the duping delight that researchers tended to show exists in independent cheating tasks and often assumed to be displayed in interpersonal lying contexts may not necessarily occur in a situation like a negotiation where your lie has the potential to harm the target you are lying to. We also think that these findings reveal important insights into when lying might be likely to elicit guilt. So one thing we found evidence of is that guilt, hold up. Okay, so one thing we found evidence of is that guilt that was induced by deception tended to increase with higher stakes. So there's some previous work showing that liars and truth tellers alike experience more intense generalized negative emotions when there are high stakes. But I think what our findings suggest is that guilt specifically might more distinctively differentiate liars from truth tellers, especially when the stakes are high. But one thing to note is that we also failed to find evidence of guilt lasting very long in deceivers. It only took the course of about a 5 to 10 minute negotiation with a counterpart for any guilt associated from the first negotiation to be alleviated. So this suggests that liars only really experience more guilt than truth tellers for a relatively brief period after telling a lie. And then a final thing our findings might demonstrate is that even when they pay off economically, undetected lies can leave deceivers dissatisfied with their relationship with the individuals they lie to. And this might also motivate them to exit those relationships. So it could be possible that behaviors creating interpersonal distance, maybe within an established relationship, might provide clues and be somewhat of a cue as to whether an actor told a lie within the confines of that relationship at some point, maybe in the recent past. So anyway, thanks for inviting me. Again, full citation of the paper is in the first slide. And thank you.